If you have a project of a $100,000 budget and no scope statement, I'm going to save you $30,000 today, and you don't even have to hire me yet. Big emphasis on yet. We're going to build a scope statement for your project together. So what is a scope statement? This is a document that clearly outlines the parameters of your project. It's going to include things like objectives, key deliverables, assumptions, constraints. It's essentially like a roadmap for your project. So everybody knows exactly what's going to happen, why it's happening, and what is considered within scope. And the reason this is so important is it prevents scope creep, which is like the number one culprit of budget overruns, timeline overruns, resources being stretched too thin on a project. And that is when there is additional work added to the project that wasn't originally planned, and it's done without any governance. So it's added, but you don't make any adjustments to the timeline or the resources being thrown at the project. So you can kind of get an idea of why scope creep is such an issue. So let's talk about the cost of not having a scope statement. So if your project is $100,000, we'll talk about it in percentages and then dollars. The dollars we're specifically using the example of a $100,000 budget. So first of all, avoiding scope creep, and I'm looking on my notes here so I don't misspeak any of these numbers. Avoiding scope creep can save 10 to 25% of your budget. So if you have that $100,000 budget, that is 10 to 25 grand. Reducing rework and misalignment can save you 5 to 15% of your project cost. Preventing delays and overruns is 10 to 20% of project cost, and optimizing resource allocation can save on 5 to 10% of your project cost. So these are not small numbers, especially when you start working with, $100,000 is a pretty small, medium-sized project. When you get up into those $1 million projects, you're really saving the company a lot of money. And this is why project managers are paid the big bucks, is because we save companies so much money. Okay, so I'm gonna throw a screenshot up on the screen of a scope statement here, and we're gonna talk about the key elements. So you have your project name, your project manager, the date that this is being completed. You're gonna want the purpose, the why. And this is not the business objective, this is the why. This is why this business objective exists. And then the next section is the business objective itself. And these should be quantifiable. So these should not be like, improve the user experience of the site. It should be like reduce customer churn rate on site by 25%. Or increase qualified lead conversions on site by X%, or whatever your project, whatever makes sense for your project, but you want to quantify those. You're also going to have your scope description. So anything that is within scope and then out of scope, these are all of your exclusions. So if you're doing a website, for example, maybe something that's out of scope is that you're not going to do any of the social media that's attached to the relaunch of the website. That is for a different team or a different project. So that would be out of scope. But what's in scope is, creating the homepage, creating the secondary pages, creating the tertiary pages, getting the media loaded. Maybe out of scope is doing new photographs or new videos for the website, or the photo editing and the video editing. Things like that need to be clearly defined, or leaders will really take advantage, and not necessarily the leader who's funding the project, but external leaders of people on your project team are really the people who come in and create a lot of noise. So that's what I'm trying to save you from here. Do not overlook that out of scope box on the scope statement. So then you're gonna have your project deliverables. This is everything that needs to be done. It does not need to be everything that's broken down. So if you have like create homepage, when you're plugging create homepage into your project management tool, you're probably gonna have like 30 subtasks under that. You don't need to do the subtasks here. These can be the high level project deliverables. And if you want, you could also include milestone dates. So I wouldn't include a due date on all of these. I would just be like, MVP. So maybe your MVP is just your homepage, your contact page, an about page, and a services page is going to be done in 6 months. And then the full website release will be done in 24 months, or, whatever makes sense. But I wouldn't put very specific dates with your deliverables. I would just put high level milestone dates. You're gonna want to talk about constraints. So, time, if you're working with a big corporation, a lot of your team members are probably working on other projects. That should be noted in the constraint section. So maybe when you're doing discovery, you find out that, only 20% of the week, your developers can only dedicate 20% of their week to this project. That is a constraint. Cost constraint, you're given this budget. I would put the budget in the constraint category all of the time, even if you have like a $5 million budget, because that budget will be spent so fast, and most of it on your resources. So take that into consideration. Risks that might come up. You'll discover a lot of different risks as you're going through discovery. And as the project continues, there could be more constraints around resources, like maybe there's a small knowledge gap, or maybe there's the need to hire a contractor down the road. And the next box is assumptions. So an assumption would be like, we assume that the current content management system that we work within is going to support the work that we're doing. So we did not, like if your website is currently on WordPress and you're planning to continue the redesign on WordPress, you're assuming that all of your redesign plans will work on WordPress. And that is because, you've done the research and you're like, okay, we're good to go, but it's still an assumption that you won't need to start from scratch with a completely different content management system. So those are all things that need to be captured here. And finally, cost estimate. So these are like name of resource. This could be a tool. This could be a person. This could be machines or equipment that you need. Estimated cost. Actual cost will be filled in later. Cost until completion and variance. So these are cost until completion and variance and actual cost are all things that you would have to update throughout the project. So you could take them or leave them on a scope statement, but I would at least include the item and the estimated cost because leaders are going to want it. So when you are building your own scope statement, I have 4 steps and then some do nots. So the first thing is you're going to want to get all of your key stakeholders in one room and you want to figure out who should be involved in identifying the project scope. Should it be clients? Should it be team members? Should it be vendors? You don't want this to be too big of a group, but you don't want to leave anybody out. So try to be, lean on the project sponsor, whoever's funding the project to help you identify this and look back at your business objective and your purpose and make sure that all of the people that you need are in the room with you. And you want to make sure you have a very collaborative approach. This is where a project manager comes in handy. They can facilitate the discussion. We are trained to do things like this. There are different methodologies, different exercises that we can do to encourage participation, keep everybody on track, and keep information going both ways. Step 2 is to ask the right questions. So you've got to get to the bottom of what is in scope, out of scope, what are the project deliverables, what is necessary, what is a nice to have, what is a must have, identify risks, identify limitations, which would be constraints, identify assumptions, get everything out on paper. It's going to be a really long, messy list that then the project manager will have to condense into the scope statement, but you need to ask all of those questions. What are the goals? How are we going to get there? Where are we limited on resources? Is that something that we need to track as a risk? Flag these early and often for the stakeholders so they're on top of it. If you need more resources, never shut up about the fact that you need more resources. Hold them accountable. Step 3 is to define boundaries and constraints. So this is kind of going back to the earlier point. Just make sure that you really hammer home what the project is not responsible for and what you as a project manager will not be tracking, so there isn't confusion down the line. Because what's very common in a project that extends, 6+ months is that leaders will forget about some of these limitations just because they have a lot going on. And leaders tend to have squirrel syndrome where they're like, oh, we want to do this. Oh, we want to do this. And as a project manager, it can be really frustrating because it's like, okay, hold on. We said we were not doing that and here's why. So make sure I keep a decision log of this kind of stuff of like, okay, we decided this on this day. This is the person who decided it and this was why. So when they come back to me in 9 months, I'm like, here's what we decided. If you want to do this, it's going to have to go through the formal change order process. Step 4 is to just use a scope template and use the same one across your organization for every project. Get stakeholders used to seeing a scope statement. Make sure this just becomes an integral part of the routine. This is where a PMO comes in handy because a project manager can use this for a single project, but then a different project manager could use a different scope statement on a different project. These 2 projects could have shared stakeholders, and it just creates confusion, a lack of consistency. A PMO makes sure that they're all using the same templates, and that those templates have flexibility if they need to across different projects, but there's no surprises, and everybody in the organization is very used to seeing what they're seeing. So let's talk about the do nots of a scope statement. First of all, do not list vague objectives, and we talked about this a little in the beginning. Don't just say we want to increase user experience. I think the example I wrote down is, do not just write we want to improve sales, have it be we want to increase sales by 20% in 6 months. 2, don't ignore your stakeholders' input. Explain why getting information from all the parties is important, and then when your stakeholders are talking, don't ignore them. If you don't understand it, just keep asking questions until you do. And remember that project managers are not expected to be the subject matter experts. We are expected to ask the questions, and half the time I feel dumb at first. I'm 2 questions into being like, I don't get it. And then I realize that the leader actually doesn't really understand what they're saying either, which is a huge culprit of added scope in a project, whether it's scope creep or a change order. Leaders don't always even understand what they're saying. So if you make them explain it, then they can, draw on their team members to help them kind of form that idea, and you have a much clearer scope statement, clearer expectations, a lot less confusion down the line. Do not skip defining boundaries. Do not skip that out of scope part. Do not skip the assumptions or the constraints. It is so annoying in the beginning, and if you're working with like developers or techie people, they might be a little bit agitated by you. They will be kissing your feet in about 3 months when everybody forgets about discovery. My thing's about to ding. And there's confusion and nobody remembers who decided what, and you're like, well, I documented this here, and you're gonna end up saving your organization so much money. And they might not see that at first because it's really hard to understand the value of project management until you don't have it. But if you can point to old projects and be like, look how much scope creep we had before we did all this work on exclusions and the out of scope work versus the amount of money that we did not go over, or the timeline that we did not go over by having a stricter scope process. That doesn't mean that things don't get added to the scope. Stuff happens. You have to understand that as a project manager, you have to be able to roll with it, but you can put it through the formal change process by having these exclusions defined early, often, and clearly. The final thing is to not underestimate risks and assumptions. This all goes into the same vein. You don't want surprises down the line. Your team doesn't want surprises down the line. It adds budget, it adds time, you might have to pull in more resources. It's gonna burn out the team. It's just gonna be a lot of conversations that are not fun for you and that you don't wanna have. Identify the risks, identify the assumptions, check in on them often. Hold people accountable, even if they're a little bit agitated because they're like, this is redundant. As a project manager, that is your job. And by doing that, you're going to save yourself so many headaches and your team so many headaches down the road. A solid scope statement is essential for saving time, money, and resources. It will prevent you from costly missteps and helps your project stay on track, helps you stay within budget. And if you have a PMO that helps you implement this as a project manager, because as a solo project manager, trying to get everybody to do this is definitely going to be a little bit of a struggle. It's not impossible, but it's a struggle. If your organization has a PMO, which is what my brand comes in and we implement for companies, your project managers still have to work on the adoption piece of it, but they don't have to do the implementation piece of it. They just have to do their job, which is everything I just outlined, but they're doing it within these governance processes that the PMO has established, which holds not only the project manager accountable, but also the stakeholders, the team members, the clients, the vendors, etc. So don't underestimate the cost savings of this one small exercise. Try it on your next project. If you need help or if you want some of that PMO governance I'm talking about, check my description for my email, hit me up. I do complimentary discovery calls. I'll also do a complimentary audit for your brand, and we can talk about kind of where we have some low-hanging fruit, some quick wins, and we can get you back on track, saving money and probably also increasing employee morale.